Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is our fourth lesson and our final lesson in Masechet Megillah. Don't worry, next week we're going to start a new Masechet. Just a reminder for those of you who don't remember, you need to re-register or register for the next Masechet. That is at Web Yeshiva. So, and I'll send out a reminder next week as well. So. Today we are going to review Daf 24 through 32. I'll try to talk fast, but we do have more dafim than we usually have because the truth is that we really only finish on Thursday, but I wanted to finish today with everybody, so I added 2 extra daf to tonight's class. Okay, so let's get started. The bottom of Daf 23 has a new Mishnah. That talks about reading the Torah. So the Gemara says the Mishnah says that when reading the Torah, you have to read at least 3 verses at a time, right? Each time that you read 3 verses at least. If there's a translator, then you only read 1 verse at a time. So it's important to understand that in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they actually had 2 people standing during the Torah reading. One person would read from the Torah, which is in Hebrew, and there would be another person who is a translator who would say the verse in an Aramaic so that everybody would understand what the person was reading. So the Mishnah tells us that if there's a translator, you read 1 verse at a time so that there's time for the translator to translate. At the top of Daf 24, we speak about the Haftarah. Haftarah is the portion, the weekly portion from the prophets that's read every week, and that you can read 3 verses at a time, even if there's a translator. The Mishnah tells us that you can jump around in one reading if you're in the prophets, but in the Torah, you need to stay in the same area. You can't jump around to different sections. But if there is a translator, you can roll the Torah to get to another part as long as you don't make the people wait. The Gemara tells us that the 3 verses, why do we have a minimum of 3 verses? It comes from the idea of the fact that the Tanakh is 3 sections, right? Torah, Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, writings. So that's 3. Therefore, the minimum is 3 verses. We then get the Gemara talks about this idea of skipping. So we said that as long as it's in the same topic, you can actually skip around a little bit. In Navi, in the prophets, you can skip even to another section, even if it's about a different topic, but you cannot skip to a different book, except for, of course, Trei Asar. Trei Asar literally means 12, and it's the last section in the prophets, and it's 12 small books of prophets. One of them famously is Jonah, that's read on Yom Kippur. So this is, it's considered 12 different books, but for this discussion, it's actually considered 1 book, and you can skip from one of those small prophets to another. The next Mishnah tells us that one who reads from the Haftarah, he also says Shema, and he repeats the silent Amidah, the Shmona Asrei. And if he's a Kohen, he can do the Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. Here we have the Mishnah tells us that a minor can read from the Torah or can translate from the Torah, but a minor cannot be a Chazan or do Birkat Kohanim, or to do the priestly blessings. It's not, again, the term that we had last week, it's not Kavod L'Tzibur, right? It's not honoring the community if a minor leads the prayer or does these things, but his father or his teacher can do it for him. From here, the Mishnah starts to talk about different laws that have to do with prayer. So especially communal prayer. We're going to get back to the communal idea at the end. But the Mishnah tells us that if your legs are exposed, you cannot read from the Torah or be the chazan, the cantor who leads the prayer, or bless the community. A blind person can lead the Shema and translate from the Torah, or maybe there's an idea that if the person never saw in their lives, then they cannot lead the Shema or do these things. It continues that a person who was chazan, he was the leader of the prayer, that person used to get paid. But the person reading the Torah or the Haftarah didn't. So therefore, the Gemara tells us that therefore the person who does the Haftarah can also lead the prayer and therefore get compensated for that as well. Why do we talk about being blind with Shema? The Gemara explains, we say Yotzer HaMeorot, God created the luminaries, right, the planets. And the Gemara says that this blind person never saw the sun. How can he thank God for the sun? The Gemara says, but wait a minute, even blind people benefit from the sun. I thought they were going to say like the heat or something like that. But interestingly, the Gemara gives a beautiful story about this idea of a blind person who holds a torch when he's walking at night. And the people ask him, why are you holding a torch? You know, it's nighttime. You can't see it. What does it matter? So he says, I don't hold the torch for myself. I hold it so that people will see me and they will help me. So it's a beautiful idea about seeing and being seen. So I thought it was just a beautiful idea, and the idea that right, the blind person wants people to see him, to help him as well. So I thought it was just a beautiful idea. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that if a Kohen, a priest, has lesions on his hands, he cannot do the priestly blessing. So this is just important to understand. I'll just explain for a minute. As part of a communal prayer, certain times in the year, definitely outside of Israel or in Israel, it's important to know that we do the priestly blessings every day. But the idea here is that the priests come before the community and praise them and bless them. They generally extend their hands out, and there is a custom that they cover themselves, meaning their faces and their hands, with their prayer shawl, with the talit, so that you don't see them. There's something spiritual about this idea, and we're not really supposed to look at the priests when they're doing the blessing. What's interesting here is it seems that maybe people could see their hands, and therefore the Mishnah tells us that if you have lesions on your hands and people will see it, it'll distract them, and therefore you should not bless the people if you have issues with your hands. Even if the Mishnah says, even if he has dye on his hands, right, something that's going to attract attention is not appropriate. The Gemara says if it's on their hands or their face or their feet, it's not okay. If it's somewhere else where we don't see, that's different. The Gemara says even if he has white splotches on his hands, or if they're crooked, anything that's going to draw attention. Since we're talking about Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests, the Gemara says that people from certain cities in Israel can't do the blessing because they don't pronounce the words properly, and therefore it changes the meaning of the blessing, and therefore they can't do the blessing, which is an interesting idea. The Gemara says if you tear a lot, you shouldn't do the blessing either, the Birkat Kohanim, or if he's blind in one eye. But if everybody in the city knows who this person is and it won't attract attention, so then it is okay. The next Mishnah at the bottom of 24, if someone takes a vow not to be the chazan, not to lead the communal prayer, in colored clothing, then you shouldn't let him be the chazan even in white clothing, which seems very strange. The Gemara is going to explain it in a minute. The Mishnah continues that you shouldn't wear round tefillin. Again, the tefillin are boxes; they're square. The Gemara says you shouldn't wear round ones because they can be very dangerous. And if your tefillin is in the wrong place, meaning in between your eyes instead of on the top of your head, or I should say the top of your forehead, or it's on your palm instead of on your arm, then this is a sign that the person is a heretic, and therefore, stay away from this person. The Gemara explains that what's this idea of not leading the prayer in colored clothing versus white clothing? The Gemara tells us that this is actually seems to be a sign of a heretic. The idol worshippers used to not worship their idols in colored clothing. They would only wear white clothing. So it seems that because this sounds very suspicious, we don't let this person lead the prayers at all. What's the issue of the square tefillin? The Gemara tells us that it is a law. We say in the Gemara, it says it's a halacha leMoshe miSinai, which means that this is a law that was given directly to Moshe at Sinai, but not written down anywhere. It was orally given, that the dimensions and the shape of the tefillin need to be in a certain way, and therefore, if you change them, it seems to be heretical and you cannot use them. It seems it's also dangerous as well. Okay, Daf 25, we have a Mishnah at the top of the page that the heretics say, and we're going to have a list of things that heretics say, right? Good ones will bless you. Right, the idea is, no, God will bless you, and it's not about good and bad. Or the Gemara says that we quiet people who say various blessings. Again, they all seem to be suspicious, and therefore we quiet these people, or if they explain verses in the wrong way. This is another sign that they are not God-fearing people. So the Gemara says, right, if someone says modim modim, right, this is from the prayer in the silent Amida, where we are grateful to God. But if you say modim modim, right, I'm grateful, it sounds like you're grateful to two people, right, or to two gods. Therefore, that is problematic. Right, this idea of God being good, right? The Gemara says you don't only mention God for good. We also, right, we know that there is a blessing. We learned in Masechet Brachot that there's a blessing for God even when things are not good, right? Unfortunately, when we hear that somebody has passed away, we make a bracha, we make a blessing, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, right? Blessed is the true judge, meaning this idea is that we accept that God, has his reasons that we don't necessarily understand, and therefore we are thankful to God for good and for bad, which is challenging, but something that we need to do. Okay, right. The next thing the Gemara talks about is the law of Shiluach Haken. Shiluach Haken is the idea that we send away the mother bird before we take the baby bird. This seems very ethical, moral. The Gemara says we have to be careful to not think only that it's a moral thing, that's why we do it, but we do it because God told us, right? If we start to give reasons for everything, it becomes dangerous, right? Or the Gemara says that if you say it's because God has mercy on the birds, then it's implying that maybe God doesn't have mercy on everybody else, which is not the case. And here, the Gemara goes on to tell stories of people who added different things to their Amidah, to their Shmona Esrei. And the Gemara tells us we need to keep to, we would say keep to the script, right? We are given words. These words were actually composed almost 2,000 years ago, and therefore there is power in those words. So that's important to understand. Very famous line on Daf 25, right? Hakol bidei shamayim chutz miyirat shamayim, right? Everything is in the hands of God except for the fear of God, right? And this is a beautiful idea that, right, God controls everything except for how I relate to God, right? That's in my control. I have free will. The same thing we said, right? Modim, modim, the same thing for Shema. You can't say Shema, Shema twice. It sounds like you're talking to two gods. And the Gemara talks about proper intent that we need to have in our prayer. The next Mishnah on Daf 25 tells us that some verses, remember we were talking about reading the Torah and then translating them. So because we were talking about that, the next Mishnah tells us that some verses we should not translate or weren't translated. These are verses that seem to imply one thing, but they really mean something else, or let's say could be taken out of context. So, for example, it says Reuven slept with Yaakov's wife. It doesn't really mean, right? We don't translate it because it doesn't really mean that Reuven slept with his father's wife. Rather, he moved the bed. The story of Yehuda and Tamar is translated. Again, the story where Tamar seduces Yehuda to sleep with her. The story of the golden calf. The first time it's read and translated, the second time it's mentioned in Sefer Dvarim and Deuteronomy, it is not translated. The priestly blessings and the story of David and Amnon are not translated. Again, the Gemara is going to explain why. Ma'aseh Merkava, which is in the prophets, which talks about what it looks like in heaven, right? God is sitting on a throne that's led by 4 angels. It's a very interesting chapter. So the Gemara says it's not read as a Haftarah because it holds certain secrets, or the Mishnah says maybe it can be read. The Gemara now lists a whole list of things that, again, are read and translated. These are things that could be misinterpreted, but the Gemara says, some things you do read, some things you don't. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can look at it on Daf 25. And again, the Gemara gives reasons for each thing, right? Meaning the idea that these are important things to be read and translated for everyone to understand, or certain other things could be misinterpreted and therefore they're not translated. The Gemara says that sometimes you read verses in a more refined way. Maybe the words are not so good, so you read it in a little bit of a different way. And the Gemara ends with talking about the praise of someone with a good reputation. With that, we finish the 3rd chapter. We are now going to begin and then hopefully complete the 4th chapter. So the Mishnah tells us at the bottom of 25, and just as an introduction, the last chapter of this Masechet is going to speak about the sanctity of the Beit Kneset, of the synagogues. So the Gemara is going to explain what this means. So the Mishnah says, if people sold a town square, they need to use the money to buy a shul, right? Again, a synagogue, because we use the money, excuse me, we're going to use the money in order to buy something that has more sanctity. If you sold a synagogue, you need to use the money to buy an Aron Chodesh, the ark that holds the Torah. And then if you sell that, you need to buy the covers for the Torah. If you sell the covers for the Torah, you have to buy Farim, which means scrolls of all like sacred books, not necessarily a Sefer Torah. But if you sell those scrolls, you need to buy a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll. And if you sell a Torah scroll, so you can't go down in that list. We just went up in that list. You can't go down. And basically, even the leftover money has sanctity to it that you need to be careful what you're buying, what you're using that money for. The Gemara tells us on Daf 26 that maybe selling the town square doesn't have sanctity. Again, what is the issue? The Gemara tells us that if you remember in Masechet Ta'anit, we learned that when there was a fast day, they used to go out to the town square to pray. And therefore, the Mishnah says that gives a certain sanctity to the town square, and therefore it has sanctity. Another opinion is that it does not have sanctity there. The Mishnah then says, if a village shul, a village synagogue versus a city synagogue, the city synagogue is communal. You cannot sell it, again, because let's say you have tourists who come there. It's not just only for the people who live there. I see Zohar asks a scribe. Excellent. The scribe is selling the Torah for people to read from it. So that is okay. It is his livelihood. Here we're talking about the community or the synagogue selling their items. So it's a good question. We'll talk about needing money in a minute, but excellent question. Okay, the Gemara brings up a coppersmith shul in Jerusalem that they actually sold the shul. How could they sell it? You just said it's communal, you can't sell it. The Gemara says no, it was a small private shul that didn't have any outside funding, and therefore the people in the area could sell it. From here we get into a whole discussion about Jerusalem. Is it public or is it private, in the sense that was it tribal land or is it national land? And the Gemara explains that basically there's a machloket about Jerusalem, right? Is it like Washington, D.C., right? It's not part of any state. It's its own, national city. Or was it divided between the two tribes, one to the north, which is Binyamin, the other to the south, which is Yehuda? So again, one opinion is that Jerusalem was divided actually down the middle, literally through the temple, through the Beit HaMikdash. I think we learned it in Yuma. But this idea that the Binyamin and Yehuda actually split the temple grounds, or another option is that no tribe owned Jerusalem, and therefore it belonged to no one and to everyone. Okay, the Gemara continues and tells us that if the councilmen, right? I guess we would call it the shul board, right? If they sold it in front of the townspeople, then the money and the shul don't have sanctity anymore. But if not, meaning if not everybody was aware of this sale, so then they still have a sanctity. What if they want to knock down an old shul and use the bricks to build a new one in like a different area? So the Gemara says, no, right? You shouldn't knock it down to build the old shul, right? You have to build the new shul and then you can knock it down, right? We're scared you're going to end up not building the new property. The Gemara says you can't rent out or mortgage a shul because it retains its sanctity. But you can, sorry, 1 second. Okay, sorry. Yes, so it retains its sanctity. Also, the bricks, it can be sold though, right? So the bricks of the shul can be sold, but not lent, because again, if you lend it out, they retain its sanctity. There's a machloket if you can give the shul as a gift, right? Some say that that's okay. Others say it's not, because again, you're getting some sort of benefit out of it, and that is not okay. From here, we get into a discussion about what's called in Hebrew tashmishei mitzvah or tashmishei kedusha, which means things that are used in order to perform a mitzvah, or things that are used in order to assist with something that's holy, meaning not the actual item, but an accessory, right? So, what is let's say a tashmish for a mitzvah? That is, right? Let's say, like very easily, right? A sukkah, lulav, shofar, right? These are things that are used to perform a mitzvah, but after the mitzvah is over, those items do not retain sanctity, and therefore you can throw them out. But tashmishei kedusha, things that have sanctity to them, they need to be buried, right? What we call gniza. Gniza means to bury in the ground as opposed to throwing it out. So this would be your mezuzah, tefillin, books, right? Holy books, the cases for the tefillin, the cover for the Torah, right? All of these things are accessories to something holy, and therefore they need to be buried. The Gemara tells us that the fabric wrappings of a Torah can be used as shrouds for a dead body, right? Again, because we're going to be burying it, and you can bury a Torah with. They said the Gemara says you should bury the Torah with a holy person or a sage, a wise person, and you should put the Torah in a clay container next to this person to preserve it. Okay, from here we're going to get into a discussion about shuls, right, the synagogue versus the Beit Midrash, right? Beit Midrash is the study hall, right? Which one has more sanctity? So, right, the yeshiva or the synagogue. So the Gemara seems to say at the bottom of 26, right, that if you sell a shul, you can use the money for the study hall because it's going up in sanctity, but not vice versa. It seems that would be problematic. The Gemara tells us at the top of 27 that after the destruction of the temple, now again, as I said, there's a discussion as to where is God, right? Where is his sanctity? One option is that it's in the Beit Midrash, right, in the study halls. The other is that it's in the Beit Kneset, in the synagogues, right? And again, I think it's interesting, and we'll see this in a minute, this idea of the learning versus the praying, right? So it's an interesting juxtaposition. There are different places in the Gemara that talk about which one is better or holier, but it's an interesting idea, and we'll see it in a second. Okay, the Gemara says, can you sell an old Torah for a new one? One answer is yes. The other is maybe no. The Gemara then says you can put the Torah. Here is Daf 27 is the source of if you're piling sacred books one on top of the other, how do you do that? The Gemara says that you should put the Torah on top, and then right, that basically Chumash, right, the 5 books of Moses go on top of the prophets and the writings, right? So there is a hierarchy, even in the Tanakh itself. The Gemara continues and tells us that you can sell the Torah to learn a Torah or to get married, right? So Zohar spoke about livelihood. What if you have a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll in your house, and you need money? So again, it depends what you need the money for, but for certain things, you are allowed to sell the Torah scroll. Again, here the Gemara talks about a sale and the leftover money, does it retain sanctity or not? The same thing with charity as well. The Mishnah on Daf 27 tells us that you can sell a public synagogue to a private owner because that is okay. From a big city to a small city is okay. It's still going to be used as a communal, a place of prayer. The next Mishnah says, right, don't sell a shul, except if you stipulate that they can buy it back, right? It shows that you love the synagogue. You don't really want to sell it, but you have to for whatever reason, whatever you can. Or the Mishnah says, no, it needs to be, right, a real sale, a real sale and not with a stipulation. The Gemara says you cannot sell a synagogue if you know it is going to become a bathhouse, a tannery, a mikvah, or like a laundry mat or a bathroom, right? We can understand all of these things are very problematic. We wouldn't want to right desecrate the synagogue. Or, says Rabbi Yehuda, we sell it as a sale, as if it's a courtyard, and then the people can do with it whatever they want, right? Meaning we're not actively building those things, and therefore it would be okay. The Gemara says that there would be a problem with interest, right? If you sell the shul and then try to buy it back, it could be a problem of interest, which we know is an issue. Okay. From here, the Gemara goes into a long list of sages that lived a long time, and their students ask them why they merited to live a long time, right? What did they do? So there's a whole list of things. One second. Okay. The Gemara says that there were different sages, right? They didn't call people by their nicknames. They only made kiddush on wine. Rav Huna sold his belt in order to buy wine for kiddush. That's how important having wine was for kiddush. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua lived long because he never used the shul as a shortcut. He never stepped over people in the study hall. He always said the blessing for the priestly blessings, and the Gemara continues with different sages and the different ways they merited to live a long life. The Gemara on Daf 28 says that also, a sage never embarrassed someone. They never went to sleep upset. So just interesting list of things, I guess, advice to us on how to behave. Right? One, Rabbi Nechunya didn't accept presents, and he was always very giving with his money, and with that he merited long life. He was not exacting of his midot, meaning of his character. He was very forgiving, and the Gemara continues in terms of other reasons the sages lived a very long life. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that we can't use a ruined shul for eulogies, or as a place to make ropes, or to set traps, or to dry fruit on the roof, right? Again, it is no longer being used as a synagogue. We shouldn't use it as, an empty lot. You shouldn't use it as a shortcut. And if it's, right, because it seems to still be holy, even if it's in disrepair, you cannot uproot the weeds that are growing there, because that will just lead us to anguish, and we do not want that to happen. The Gemara explains this Mishnah that you cannot be frivolous in shul or eat or drink there in general. So that's just interesting in terms of the laws of the sanctity of the synagogue. When it's ruined, you need to leave it alone. And from here, the Gemara talks about the synagogues in Bavel that were built on a stipulation that if you need the space for something else, you can use it, right? And therefore, it was used, I guess it seems, as a community center, but still you shouldn't do business dealings there. The Gemara talks about not running into shul to get out of the hot sun or the rain, right? We don't use the synagogue as a shortcut or as a haven to get out of the rain. That's not what the synagogue is all about. what if you need to call someone from the synagogue, and so you don't need to go to pray, but you want to go in for a minute? What would you do? So you go in, you say a law or a mishnah or a verse from the Bible, or you wait a few minutes, and then you go get the person that you need, and then you can leave. You can give a public eulogy in a shul, for a great person. Actually, right, that is done when there are, if a great sage has passed away, sometimes they do give the eulogies in the synagogue itself. From here, the Gemara talks about different eulogies for different sages, and the Gemara talks about the crown of Torah is halacha, right? Is Jewish law, and that person shouldn't serve other students, right? That they shouldn't serve others. That students can serve other students, and if you learn the halacha, the laws, you are guaranteed olam haba, right? A place in the next world. Daf 29. If people aren't around, you can interrupt your Torah learning to go to a funeral or a wedding. The Gemara explains, what does it mean people aren't around, right? How many people do you need for a funeral or a wedding? The Gemara says 12,000 people or maybe 24,000 people, right? I think the point here is you always interrupt your learning in order to pay your last respects, right? To go to a funeral or to be to l'sameach, to rejoice at a wedding as well, right? Both of these are mitzvot, are commandments, and we should do both of those things. The Gemara tells us that God loves the Jewish people so much that he actually went into exile with them, right? He went to Egypt, to Bavel, and ultimately God will return with the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel, right? And here, right, very interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, right, the Gemara tells us on Daf 29 that God can be found in the synagogues in Bavel, right? And here there are stories of sages that heard a heavenly voice in the synagogue, again, in Bavel, and they quickly left the shul because they realized God's presence was there. Again, here the Gemara gives us a very famous concept that the synagogue is what's called a mikdash me'at, right? A small sanctuary, right? Meaning as opposed to the Beit HaMikdash, right? The temple, which is the house of sanctity. Our synagogues are a smaller version of that. And therefore, and here, as I said before, right, a very famous idea, Abaye used to study his Torah, his learning at home, and then he would go to pray in Shul. And then he realized that God is in the Shul, so he started learning there as well. What's very interesting is we have a very similar story, but the opposite, right? That they used to pray at home and then go to the study hall to study. And when they heard that God resides in the study hall because that's where Jewish law is being developed, they started praying in the study hall. So I think it's just a beautiful idea when you put those two together. I think we can definitely agree that God is in both places. And that, again, here, I think the point is that there is great value in learning and prayer, and both of them should be a means to connecting to God. I think that's really the point here, that we are meant to be, I would say, growing spiritually, religiously from our learning as we do from our prayers as well. So that's just a side point, or an important point. The Gemara continues on 29 that says, again, very interestingly, that in the future, all the synagogues of exile will be transported and established in Israel. And I'm actually on a few WhatsApp groups of people who teach Daf Yomi, and they were talking about, first of all, a beautiful idea that if any of you have been to the Israel Museum, where they have literally, right, brought over synagogues from different places in the world. So literally, we're watching that happen, and it's just a fascinating concept of these shuls actually getting to Israel. Physically, but I think also the concept is right, more figuratively, right, that the people, the communities, will come to Israel as well. Um, um, okay. Next, the Gemara talks about how to behave in a cemetery, right? We've been talking about how to behave in a synagogue, how to behave in a cemetery. Again, similar ideas. You cannot be frivolous. You can't let your animals graze there. You can't pass a water canal through it. You shouldn't pick the grass there. Again, and if you do, you should burn it, right? Not to get any pleasure from that grass. Okay, the next Mishnah on Daf 29 is going to talk about what's called the four parshiot, the four Torah portions that are read around the time of Purim till Pesach, right? There are four special Torah readings that are read in this time, and the Gemara is going to go through when these are read, what is read. So let's go through it. So the Mishnah tells us the first of these portions is called Shkalim, right? If you remember, we learned in Masechet Shkalim about the machatzit shekel, the half a shekel that was collected from all the Jewish people. So that collection started on the beginning of Adar, and therefore we read Parshat Shkalim around, right, whenever Rosh Chodesh Adar is, right, the week of Rosh Chodesh Adar. The next of the four is Parshat Zachor, where we talk about remembering Amalek. The third is Para Aduma, where we talk about the red heifer. And the fourth is HaChodesh, right, which talks about Rosh Chodesh, which is going to be before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The Mishnah tells us that this interrupts the regular Torah reading. Right, we have Torah reading for Rosh Chodesh, for the first of the month, for Chanukah, for Purim, fasts. The Gemara is going to go through what is read for each one of these days. Again, there's a special reading for each holiday. The Gemara tells us that, again, as I said, Rosh Chodesh Adar, the beginning of Adar, they announced the collection of Machatzit HaShekel, and therefore we read the Shabbat Shkalim around the time that week of Rosh Chodesh Adar. There's a machloket, what is read for Parshat Shkalim, and we actually read again in Sefer Shmot when it talks about them bringing the machatzit hashekel, right, the half a shekel. There's a machloket if you read the regular weekly portion during the 4 weeks. The answer is we do, right? We read the regular weekly portion, plus we have additional reading, which is the maftir, the last aliyah. We're going to read from these 4 sections. The Gemara now goes through what about on Shabbat, which is Rosh Chodesh Tevet and Chanukah, right? We actually had it, if I'm not mistaken, this year, right, where we have a lot of Torah readings to read because it's Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah. Again, very famous concept that we've learned before, Tadir v'she'eno Tadir. Tadir kodem, what does that mean? Right, something that is frequent. If it is at the same time of something that is less frequent, we do the more frequent thing first, right? So Shabbat is frequent, right? It's every week. So you read the portion of Shabbat first, then Rosh Chodesh, which is once a month, and then Chanukah, which is once a year. So that's just a very good rule for us to understand. Okay, here Daf 30 tells us how we're going to read these portions. What's very interesting is that the Parshat Shkalim that we read is in the weekly portion of Kitisa. Kitisa is in the book of Shmot, And it's usually around the time that we would be reading this. So it's interesting, the Gemara discusses what happens if Parshat Shkalim is that week or the week before or the week after. Are we going to reread something that we read the week before or the week after? The answer is yes. But you're going to read it, again, as we mentioned, at the end of the weekly portion. So it's very clear that it's being read as a special edition and not as the weekly portion. Okay, from here, the Gemara talks about depending on when Rosh Chodesh Adar is going to determine when we read this special portion. So if Rosh Chodesh Adar is on a Friday, you read Parshat Shkalim the week before, or maybe you read it the day after, right? That Shabbat. The same thing with Zachor, right? If Purim is on Friday, one option is that you read Zachor the week before, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think is the way we do it. You do not do it the day after, which is past Purim. Right, the Gemara tells us that we need to read about Amalek before Purim happens, right? So we understand the background to the story itself. HaChodesh is read before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, as I mentioned before. Okay, here the Gemara now reviews what is read for each of these parshiot and what is the Haftarah that is read on that week. It is important to know there's a very large Rashi on this daf because he talks about what happens if there are 5 weeks from the week of Rosh Chodesh Adar till Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Where do you skip a week? Right? Again, we have 4 portions, 4 parshiot that we need to read over 5 weeks. And the Rashi there describes basically depending on what day Rosh Chodesh is, will determine when you make a skip in the weekly portion. So you can look that up over there on Daf 30. Okay, afterwards, after the Torah, after these 4 parshiot, we return to the regular Haftarah, again, because we were reading the weekly portion throughout this time period as well. Okay, the next Mishnah is going to go through every festival and what was read for each festival. Right, again, every festival is going to read about that festival, right? Pesach, you read about the festival in Vayikra. On Shavuot, you read about Shavuot, which is in Dvarim. Rosh Hashanah, again, is in Vayikra. Yom Kippur is in Vayikra as well. The beginning of Sukkot, you read about the holidays in Vayikra. The rest of Sukkot, you read about the sacrifices that were given every day, which is in Bamidbar. On Chanukah, we read about the princes' gifts that they gave in Sefer Bamidbar. On Purim, we read about Amalek, as we mentioned in Shmot. And in Rosh Chodesh, we read in Bamidbar about Rosh Chodesh. Daf 31 tells us about, remember we talked about the Ma'amadot, that week that corresponds to when the priests are in the temple. So they read about the creation of the world in Breshit. On a fast day, you read the blessings and the curses in Vayikra. And the Mishnah tells us that one person needs to read all the curses. You don't split it up. And Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat afternoon, we read the next weekly portion. Okay, the Gemara on 31 basically reviews exactly what I just mentioned, just in greater detail, and it goes through each one of the festivals. And the Gemara says that, anytime we see the greatness of God, we also see his humility in Tanakh, right? Speaking about different verses in the Tanakh. The reading of Shabbat, Chol HaMoed, of Sukkot and Pesach is mentioned here on Daf 31, right? That reading. The reading of Tisha B'Av as well is mentioned here in the Gemara on Daf 31. The Gemara tells us again, very interestingly, that when you read about the sacrifices, it's as if you're bringing the sacrifices, right? Which is why, first of all, on the festivals, we read about the sacrifices that were given in our prayers as well. In the Musaf, we talk about the sacrifices that were brought. Also, this is a source for people who in their daily prayer say korbanot. There's a section in the Sidur that goes through all of the daily sacrifices or the sacrifices that were brought. There is a custom, some people say them every single day. Again, the Gemara tells us you shouldn't stop in the middle of the curses, as I mentioned before, because we don't want the person to make a blessing over getting the aliyah to say the curses, right? So we don't want to bless the fact that we're saying the curses. Therefore, you say all the curses together with a few verses before and after as well. The Gemara on Daf 32, our last Daf of the Masechet, the Gemara tells us that when you get an aliyah, you open the Torah to see where you're going to read. Then you should close it and make the blessing, and then you open it and you read it. Or maybe you don't close it. The question is, why do you have to open and close and open and close? The Gemara says that it's to show, we close it to show that the blessing that you're saying is not actually written in the Torah, right? When we read from the Torah, we're reading the Torah, not the blessing. So we close the Torah, or I think nowadays we actually just cover the Torah. The idea is that you shouldn't think that the blessing is written somewhere on the Torah itself. From here, the Gemara talks about Galila. So that is when after the Torah reading, there are two things that are done. One is called Hagba. Hagba means there's a person who's called up who lifts the Torah scroll so that everybody can see the Torah scroll. That's called Hagba. It is a very great honor to be given Hagba. Galila is after that person sits down with the Torah, somebody else comes and helps roll up the Torah and cover it again. So both of those things are seen as very important. The Gemara talks about how to roll the Torah scroll, that the seam should be in the middle, and you have to be very careful in the way that you do it. The Gemara talks about can you use a bat kol? Bat kol is a heavenly voice. What does that mean? If you, hear a voice that tells you to do something, go on a journey, become something, the Gemara asks, can you rely on that voice that you heard? The Gemara says yes. If you hear it as a male voice in the city or as a female voice in the field, and the voice has to repeat the message. If it's repeated, then interestingly enough, you can listen to it. I'll just say I once went to a prayer workshop, and the person leading it said, a lot of times we send up our prayers, but we don't always stop to listen to the answers. And he was saying that, if you close your eyes, or I don't know, I guess you can think about it in different ways. If you meditate, or if you're thinking, right, and an idea pops into your head, or your heart tells you to do something, that's God answering you, right? And he was talking about being open to hearing the answers, which we're not always open to. So I thought that was just very powerful. The Gemara continues and talks about the importance of the sing-song, the trop in which we read the Torah. And the Gemara talks about that two scholars who live in the same city should discuss the law and be consistent. Very interesting in terms of communal responsibility. The Gemara then says you shouldn't touch a Torah with your bare hands. It's not an honor for the Torah. And the Masechet ends with talking about the reading for each festival on that festival, and the importance of reading about the festival on the festival, and learning the laws on the day itself. So first of all, Hadran Alach Masechet Megillah. I saw a very nice kind of summary, a pictorial summary of the Masechet. This is from Daf HaChaim, when he gave like an introduction to the Masechet, just to remind us what the Masechet was about. Right, the first chapter we talked about when we read the Megillah, and we talked about the Megillah itself, the story of Esther and all the stories behind it. The second chapter continued talking about how we read the Megillah in terms of who can read it, how you read it, and the different laws of Purim itself. The third chapter spoke about reading the Torah and how we read the Torah, how we break up the different Torah readings. And this chapter, this fourth chapter, was about the communal sanctity of the synagogues, of the study hall. I just wanted to share one thought with you. I was trying to think about, the way that this Megillah was, this Masechet was structured, and I think definitely at the end, you might say, why were we talking about synagogues? What does that have to do with Purim, with this Masechet? And I was thinking that really this entire Masechet was about the importance of Jewish communal life. We started in the beginning talking about if you lived in this city when you read the Megillah, if you lived in another city. We really spoke about being a part of a community, taking care of different parts of that community as well. And we ended up talking about the sanctity of that community. And I think that that's just a beautiful idea that went throughout this Masechet. And a second idea was the idea of the exile, right? The story of Purim is a story of salvation in the exile, right? It's happening in Persia. It's not our usual stories of things that happen in Israel. It's happening outside of Israel. And I think that especially in this chapter, when we talked about where we find God, I think it's interesting to think about, right? We didn't talk about the Beit HaMikdash in this Masechet, right? We didn't talk about the temple. We're dealing with a situation after the temple, and the question is, where do we find God, right? Where is holiness now in the exile? I mean, even 2,000 years ago, and so more so even now. And I think really our answer was given, and that is in the Jewish community, right? That is in our sacred books, our learning, right? All of these things are first of all, I would say, uniting us as a community, as we see even right here. But really, this idea of coming together as a people through learning, through prayer, is something that is very important. And I thought it was a nice idea to kind of finish up our Masechet. So I really, wow, we did it in an hour. I really want to thank you all for learning with me, and really kol hakavod for another Masechet under your belt. And Be'ezrat Hashem, next week we're going to start Moed Katan, which is the next Masechet, and I'll talk more about it next week. So wishing everybody really kol hakavod. I hope you're all having a party, a Siyum with your friends or family, and see you all next week.
Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thank